Continuing with famous anime franchises, we move to Leiji space operas. Historically speaking, he was the first who attempted to make more serious science fiction and more plausible war drama. Gonagai didn't give a shit about seriousness, and Tezuka, despite occasionally trying to have serious messages, he was very limited by the simple fact his shows were aimed at kids. Leiji, on the other hand, was seeing everything as tragedy set in space, and that made his anime to feel far more mature than anything else that came before in terms of science fiction. Combined with how it was heavily based on patriotic ideals and an elegiac view on the devastation of war, it was extremely appealing to anyone who lived through the horrors of the Second World War. The Leiji series remained very popular throughout the 70s, but once more better animated space operas began to come out, namely Gundam and Macross, they began to lose their appeal. During the 80s, most of the Leiji fame was maintained thanks to Captain Harlock, with everything else being an afterthought or a lesser recommendation. Once the 90s came along and emphasis began to switch to Earth-based fighting shonen, the Leiji series became niche. Despite not completely forgotten and occasionally making a comeback with a remake, such as the very well-made space battleship Yamato, the Leiji formula is hard to get into for newer audiences. Aside from the obvious reasons of the animation being dated and sci-fi falling out of fashion, the character designs are weird to look at and the atmosphere is so depressing at times, it becomes misery porn. There is also not much variety amongst the various titles and seasons. It's like you're watching the exact same thing with close to no actual differences, so it can become tiresome very fast, and I can't blame anyone for not giving it a chance. The next title never had much of an impact, yet it's an interesting example of how the legacy of any show works in the long run. Rose of Versailles is without a doubt the best period drama in anime, far better than any world masterpiece theater series ever made. It can also be seen as the first time a cross-dresser character was treated with respect instead of being a gimmick or a fetish. Ribbon Kishi had done the same in the 60s, but the time period and the intended audience weren't allowing much exploration of the theme of gender politics. The more historically based setting and the teen-oriented audience was making all that far easier, and to this day it remains a serious take on dynamic and independent women at the age of absolute male dominance. Unfortunately, the amount of people interested in such topics weren't that many. Almost everyone watching anime was a male who liked giant robots and space operas. It was not feminists. Furthermore, a big factor that keeps a title relevant is sequels and reboots, and Versailles did not have that. In fact, it's currently the only major anime of the 70s that still hasn't received a remake or a spin-off. And that is why, despite being one of the most mature anime of its decade and having one of the best handled female protagonists, it was never that popular and it got forgotten by most rather fast. It came out at the end of the 70s, when period dramas lost their charm. The theme of social-political unrest was explored far better in Gundam and Legend of the Galactic Heroes, and even the whole symbol of woman empowerment was eventually replaced by Utena in the 90s. It was never popular, it became niche rather fast, all its good ideas can now be found in later titles, and the truth is most of its episodes feel quite goofy in how they portray males and historical figures. Good to check out for historical purposes, but otherwise no longer relevant for a long time. Next up we got the Gundam franchise with its very peculiar legacy. Historically, it was the first to combine the mindless action of super robots with the politics of space operas, bringing together the best elements of Gonagai and Leiji anime, while also having the most mature war drama as of yet. It went on to become one of the biggest and most recognizable mecha titles that keeps going to this day. Its impact is very weird. Unlike most series that are at the peak of popularity and cultural significance when they originally come out and gradually fade into obscurity, Gundam had the exact opposite treatment. When it first came out in the 70s, it was unpopular and was even forced to end prematurely. But thanks to the robot craze of the 80s, it was given another chance so Bandai could sell lots of toys. It worked since Gunpla were selling like crazy, but only in Japan since no Gundam anime were licensed in the West. That began in the 90s, and only with the worst entries in the franchise, most people got a very warped perception of what the real thing is about, but nonetheless the impact became even bigger thanks to that. And then came the Double O's, where they really pushed bigger entries in the West. It worked as Gundam became the most famous mecha of them all. Not quality-wise, since there were far better mecha in that decade, but sales-wise, it blew everything else out of the water, there's no denying there. It's not as impactful in the decade we are currently in, because new fags find it harder to care about robots as they do about isekai and waifus. Even so, it's the only major mecha franchise that can still guarantee a lot of sales and a lot of buzz, no matter what kind of bullshit it's going to be about. Fuck you, build fighters! This next part is not really an entry as it is a clarification. Many would think Idion deserves a mention for how influential it was for Neon Genesis or some shit like that. The truth is, it was never popular, it never had any impact, and it only inspired some later titles into ending everything with a holocaust. That's not much of a legacy, especially when even the creator of Idion eventually fused all the good ideas it had into the Gundam franchise. In fact, he did the exact same thing with all his non-Gundam titles. Whatever good ideas they had were eventually assimilated into the Borg collective that was Gundam. So let's never again mention Tomino, since everything he made and has an actual legacy can be found in Gundam. Last entry for now, and first entry for the 80s, is Rumiko Takahashi series. She popularized school comedies and the basic harem formula, beginning the slow and awful decline of anime, from amazing action-adventure set in space to boring nothing ever happens in some earthbound school. But this wasn't apparent for a while, since Urusei Yatsura and Ranma were uncommon for the time they came out, and also served as parodies of pop culture, as well as a simple critique of the decline of the nuclear family, because women could now work and men became losers. The impact these shows have is more than obvious, since rom-coms and harems of today are, unfortunately, still following the exact same formula popularized by Takahashi. And as far as staying power is concerned, it's also obvious to tell that because of how similar all these series are, they lose their glamour as time goes by and copycats keep coming out. Without a major title by her, her work became niche in the 90s before achieving an unexpected comeback in the early 00s with Inuyasha. That show was not just a school comedy, but also combined elements of fighting shonen and occult horror. It was also lucky to come out after Dragon Ball had ended and before the big three blew up in popularity, thus instantly becoming the most famous fighting shonen-romance of its time. Unfortunately, after 30 episodes it became mediocre and all the fun was gone. By the time the 10s came rolling, nobody cared for Inuyasha, and her next title, Rine, had absolutely nothing new to say and nobody cared about it, making her work niche once again. And that was her legacy, a bunch of highs and lows.